I'm Commander Stella Dalton, 41 years old, a Navy aviator who worked her way up from a tiny hometown to the cockpit of a rescue squadron. For years, I carried my family on my back. Money, time, stability, support whatever they needed, I showed up. But the day my own father publicly called me a failure, in front of a 4-star general, no less, everything shifted. Ever been dismissed, belittled, or humiliated by someone you've spent your whole life trying to lift up? If you have, share your story in the comments. You're in good company here. Before we get into what really happened, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected, hit like and subscribe. I share real stories about boundaries, strength, and taking back your worth. What came next even I didn't see coming. I grew up in a town where military service was common, but officer rank was rare. My father, Frank Dalton, served 4 years in the Army as a specialist before an honorable discharge sent him back to civilian life. He worked as a mechanic for 30 years, fixed engines, raised a family, and never quite let go of the idea that he could have been more. He talked about officers the way some people talk about lottery winners, like they'd gotten lucky, not earned it. I didn't understand that bitterness when I was young. I just knew that nothing I did seemed to impress him. I was good at school. I played varsity soccer. I worked weekends at the hardware store and saved most of what I made. My brother Ryan was 3 years younger, and Dad praised him constantly for making the JV team, for passing algebra, for remembering to take out the trash. When I brought home honor roll certificates, Dad would glance at them and say something like, "Well, you've always been decent at memorizing things." It wasn't cruel exactly. It was dismissive, which somehow felt worse. I joined Navy ROTC in college because I wanted structure and purpose, and because part of me still thought that serving might finally make him see me differently. When I told him, he laughed and said I was playing soldier. He told relatives I was doing ROTC for the scholarship money, not because I was serious about it. I let it go. I was used to letting things go. Flight school was harder than anything I'd done, but I loved it. I loved the precision, the responsibility, the clarity of knowing exactly what was expected and delivering it. I graduated near the top of my class and received my commission as an ensign. My mother cried at the ceremony. My father shook my hand and said, "Don't let it go to your head." I was 22 years old, and I'd already learned that his approval wasn't something I could earn. It was something he simply didn't give. My early years as a naval aviator were a mix of exhausting and exhilarating. I flew transport missions, logged hundreds of hours, and worked my way up to lieutenant junior grade, then full lieutenant. I sent money home when my parents needed help with the roof, with the car, with medical bills they didn't ask for help with but clearly couldn't afford. I never mentioned it. I didn't want to make it a thing. I thought maybe the help itself would speak for me. It didn't. When I made lieutenant, Dad told a neighbor I was doing some flying stuff, nothing too important. When I called home, he'd hand the phone to my mother after 30 seconds. If I tried to talk about work, he'd change the subject or say something like, "I'm sure it's all very technical." I started calling less. Not out of anger, just exhaustion. I was tired of trying to translate my life into something he could respect. I moved through my 20s and into my 30s with a growing sense of independence. I had good friends in the Navy, mentors who saw my potential, and a career that actually rewarded effort. I didn't need my father's approval anymore, but some part of me still wanted it. That one felt childish, so I buried it. I focused on my sailors, my missions, my responsibilities. I handled things. I always handled things. By the time I made lieutenant commander at 34, I'd stopped expecting acknowledgement from home. I'd also stopped expecting much of a relationship. We spoke on holidays, exchanged polite updates, and kept everything surface level. My mother would ask about my life, and I'd give her the highlights. My father would grunt occasionally from the background. It was functional, distant, and sad in a way I didn't let myself think about too much. But I kept helping. When Dad's truck broke down, I paid for the repairs. When Mom needed surgery, I covered the copays. When they couldn't afford property tax one year, I sent a check. I told myself I was doing it for Mom, or because it was the right thing to do, or because I didn't want them to struggle. All of that was true. But part of me was still that kid hoping he'd notice, hoping he'd soften, hoping something would finally click. It never did. What I didn't realize then was that I'd spent 20 years maintaining a relationship that only went one direction. I gave support, stability, money, and time. He gave criticism, dismissiveness, and silence. The imbalance had become so normal that I didn't even see it as a problem. I just saw it as the way things were with my father. You worked around it. You managed it. You didn't expect it to change. I was wrong about that last part. Things started shifting when I made lieutenant commander. The rank itself wasn't flashy, but it meant something. It meant command experience, strong evaluations, and a reputation for getting things done. It also meant I was no longer early in my career. I was mid-level leadership, someone junior officers looked to for guidance and senior officers trusted with real responsibility. Dad didn't care. When neighbors congratulated him on having a daughter in the Navy, he'd shrug and say, "She's not doing anything that important." At family gatherings, he'd introduce Ryan as a construction foreman with obvious pride, then gesture to me and say something vague like, "And Stella works for the government." If anyone pressed for details, he'd say I did security stuff or paperwork. I corrected him once. We were at a cousin's wedding and someone asked what I did. Before I could answer, Dad said, "She flies a desk mostly." I smiled tightly and said, "Actually, I'm a naval aviator." The person's eyes widened, but Dad just waved it off. "Same difference," he muttered and walked away. That was the moment I realized something had changed in him. It wasn't just dismissiveness anymore. It was resentment. I started noticing a pattern. Whenever I achieved something, he found a way to minimize it. When I told him I'd been selected for a competitive training program, he said, they probably needed to fill a quota. When I mentioned a commendation I'd received, he said, they hand those out like candy now. When I explained a complex mission I'd flown, he said, sounds like a lot of taxpayer money for not much. It was like he decided that my success was a personal affront to him. I think part of it came from his circle at the local Veterans Lodge. He'd started spending more time there, surrounded by men who traded exaggerated war stories and complained about modern military culture. They resented officer privilege, diversity initiatives, and anything that didn't match their version of real service. Dad soaked it up. He came home repeating their talking points, insisting that enlisted life was real service and that officers were just managers in uniforms. He started making comments that felt designed to hurt. A real pilot flies commercial and makes actual money. If you were a good officer, you wouldn't still be unmarried. You know, your brother actually built something with his life. I didn't argue. I just stopped sharing. I grew up in a town where military service was common, but officer rank was rare. My father, Frank Dalton, served 4 years in the Army as a specialist before an honorable discharge sent him back to civilian life. He worked as a mechanic for 30 years, fixed engines, raised a family, and never quite let go of the idea that he could have been more. He talked about officers the way some people talk about lottery winners, like they'd gotten lucky, not earned it. I didn't understand that bitterness when I was young. I just knew that nothing I did seemed to impress him. I was good at school. I played varsity soccer. I worked weekends at the hardware store and saved most of what I made. My brother Ryan was 3 years younger, and Dad praised him constantly for making the JV team, for passing algebra, for remembering to take out the trash. When I brought home honor roll certificates, Dad would glance at them and say something like, "Well, you've always been decent at memorizing things." It wasn't cruel exactly. It was dismissive, which somehow felt worse. I joined Navy ROTC in college because I wanted structure and purpose, and because part of me still thought that serving might finally make him see me differently. When I told him, he laughed and said I was playing soldier. He told relatives I was doing ROTC for the scholarship money, not because I was serious about it. I let it go. I was used to letting things go. Flight school was harder than anything I'd done, but I loved it. I loved the precision, the responsibility, the clarity of knowing exactly what was expected and delivering it. I graduated near the top of my class and received my commission as an ensign. My mother cried at the ceremony. My father shook my hand and said, "Don't let it go to your head." I was 22 years old, and I'd already learned that his approval wasn't something I could earn. It was something he simply didn't give. My early years as a naval aviator were a mix of exhausting and exhilarating. I flew transport missions, logged hundreds of hours, and worked my way up to lieutenant junior grade, then full lieutenant. I sent money home when my parents needed help with the roof, with the car, with medical bills they didn't ask for help with but clearly couldn't afford. I never mentioned it. I didn't want to make it a thing. I thought maybe the help itself would speak for me. It didn't. When I made lieutenant, Dad told a neighbor I was doing some flying stuff, nothing too important. When I called home, he'd hand the phone to my mother after 30 seconds. If I tried to talk about work, he'd change the subject or say something like, "I'm sure it's all very technical." I started calling less. Not out of anger, just exhaustion. I was tired of trying to translate my life into something he could respect. I moved through my 20s and into my 30s with a growing sense of independence. I had good friends in the Navy, mentors who saw my potential, and a career that actually rewarded effort. I didn't need my father's approval anymore, but some part of me still wanted it. That one felt childish, so I buried it. I focused on my sailors, my missions, my responsibilities. I handled things. I always handled things. By the time I made lieutenant commander at 34, I'd stopped expecting acknowledgement from home. I'd also stopped expecting much of a relationship. We spoke on holidays, exchanged polite updates, and kept everything surface level. My mother would ask about my life, and I'd give her the highlights. My father would grunt occasionally from the background. It was functional, distant, and sad in a way I didn't let myself think about too much. But I kept helping. When Dad's truck broke down, I paid for the repairs. When Mom needed surgery, I covered the copays. When they couldn't afford property tax one year, I sent a check. I told myself I was doing it for Mom, or because it was the right thing to do, or because I didn't want them to struggle. All of that was true. But part of me was still that kid hoping he'd notice, hoping he'd soften, hoping something would finally click. It never did. What I didn't realize then was that I'd spent 20 years maintaining a relationship that only went one direction. I gave support, stability, money, and time. He gave criticism, dismissiveness, and silence. The imbalance had become so normal that I didn't even see it as a problem. I just saw it as the way things were with my father. You worked around it. You managed it. You didn't expect it to change. I was wrong about that last part. Things started shifting when I made lieutenant commander. The rank itself wasn't flashy, but it meant something. It meant command experience, strong evaluations, and a reputation for getting things done. It also meant I was no longer early in my career. I was mid-level leadership, someone junior officers looked to for guidance and senior officers trusted with real responsibility. Dad didn't care. When neighbors congratulated him on having a daughter in the Navy, he'd shrug and say, "She's not doing anything that important." At family gatherings, he'd introduce Ryan as a construction foreman with obvious pride, then gesture to me and say something vague like, "And Stella works for the government." If anyone pressed for details, he'd say I did security stuff or paperwork. I corrected him once. We were at a cousin's wedding and someone asked what I did. Before I could answer, Dad said, "She flies a desk mostly." I smiled tightly and said, "Actually, I'm a naval aviator." The person's eyes widened, but Dad just waved it off. "Same difference," he muttered and walked away. That was the moment I realized something had changed in him. It wasn't just dismissiveness anymore. It was resentment. I started noticing a pattern. Whenever I achieved something, he found a way to minimize it. When I told him I'd been selected for a competitive training program, he said, they probably needed to fill a quota. When I mentioned a commendation I'd received, he said, they hand those out like candy now. When I explained a complex mission I'd flown, he said, sounds like a lot of taxpayer money for not much. It was like he decided that my success was a personal affront to him. I think part of it came from his circle at the local Veterans Lodge. He'd started spending more time there, surrounded by men who traded exaggerated war stories and complained about modern military culture. They resented officer privilege, diversity initiatives, and anything that didn't match their version of real service. Dad soaked it up. He came home repeating their talking points, insisting that enlisted life was real service and that officers were just managers in uniforms. He started making comments that felt designed to hurt. A real pilot flies commercial and makes actual money. If you were a good officer, you wouldn't still be unmarried. You know, your brother actually built something with his life. I didn't argue. I just stopped sharing. The shift became undeniable around the time I turned 36. I was home on leave, sitting in the living room while Dad watched television. A news segment came on about naval operations in the Pacific. I'd actually been part of that deployment, though I didn't say anything. Dad watched for a minute, then snorted and said, "Desk officers taking credit for enlisted work." I looked at him. "Dad, I was there. I flew those missions." He didn't even turn his head. "Sure you did." That was it. No follow-up, no curiosity, no acknowledgement. Just flat disbelief. I went upstairs and called my mentor, Captain Elena Mercer. She'd been my commanding officer 2 assignments back, and we'd stayed in touch. I told her what had just happened, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stella," she said after a long pause, "you know this isn't about you, right?" "I know," I said. But I didn't, not really. "He's threatened by you," she continued. "You've become what he wanted to be and couldn't. And instead of being proud, he's making you pay for it." I sat with that for a while. It made sense in a way I didn't want it to. "What do I do?" I asked. "You stop trying to win a game he's rigged," she said. "You stop letting him define your worth." I thought about that conversation for months. And slowly, I started pulling back, not dramatically, just gradually. I called less often. I stopped volunteering information about my career. I stopped sending money unless it was truly necessary. I stopped trying to fix things. The distance gave me clarity. I started seeing how much energy I'd spent managing his reactions, trying to minimize my achievements so he wouldn't feel small, bending myself into shapes that might finally earn his respect. It was exhausting. And it had never worked. For the first time, I let myself admit that the relationship I wanted with my father didn't exist. Maybe it never had. The breaking point came during a military charity gala in my hometown. I was 38, a lieutenant commander with a solid record and a reputation for competence. The event was a big deal locally, black tie, local officials, donors, and 2 senior officers doing outreach for the Navy. One of them was Vice Admiral Catherine Morrison, a 3-star I'd met briefly at a conference. She was formidable, brilliant, and someone I deeply respected. I flew in for the weekend. Dad had volunteered at the event for years, and Mom asked if I'd attend. I agreed, thinking it would be nice to support a good cause and maybe have a civil evening with my parents. I should have known better. The gala was held at the nicest hotel in town, which wasn't saying much. The ballroom had that generic conference center feel, beige walls, chandelier lighting, round tables with white linens. I arrived in my dress uniform, and the moment I walked in, I felt people noticing. Small towns remember their own, and a female naval aviator still turned heads. Dad was near the entrance, talking to a group of local veterans. He saw me, and his expression tightened. Not anger exactly. Something closer to irritation. Ryan arrived a few minutes later with his wife. Dad's whole face lit up. He clapped Ryan on the shoulder, introduced him to everyone nearby, made a point of talking about the houses Ryan's crew had built. When someone asked if I was his daughter too, Dad glanced at me and said, "Yeah, that's Stella. She keeps changing jobs. Can't seem to stick to anything." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. A few people looked confused. One older man said, "I thought she was in the Navy?" "She is," Dad said dismissively. "For now." I walked away before I said something I'd regret. I found Mom at a table near the back, and she gave me a tight, apologetic smile. She'd heard him. She always heard him. She just never said anything. The evening progressed. Dinner was served. Speeches were made. Vice Admiral Morrison gave a keynote about the importance of supporting service members and their families. It was a good speech, clear, heartfelt, grounded. Afterward, she mingled, and I made a point of staying out of her way. I wasn't there to network. I was there because my mother had asked. Then Dad found me. He was in the middle of a conversation with a group of donors when he saw me standing near the bar. He waved me over, and I went, assuming he wanted to introduce me properly for once. I was wrong. "This is my kid," he said, gesturing at me like I was an afterthought. "She's the one who can't figure out what she wants to do with her life." One of the donors, a woman in her 60s, looked at me with confusion. "I'm sorry, what do you do?" Before I could answer, Dad cut in. "She pushes paperwork for the Navy. Nothing hands-on. Not like real service." The woman blinked, clearly uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to respond, but Dad kept going. "She went to college, got some fancy degree, and now she sits at a desk pretending it's important work. I felt the room tilt. Not because I was angry, I'd heard worse from him, but because he was saying this in public, in front of people who mattered, at an event meant to honor service. He wasn't just dismissing me. He was humiliating me. Vice Admiral Morrison was standing 10 feet away, talking to a local councilman. She glanced over, and I knew she'd heard. I excused myself and walked toward the hallway. I needed air. I needed distance. I needed to not be in that room. Dad followed me. "What's your problem?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "You can't handle a little honesty?" I turned to face him. We were alone in the hallway now, just outside the ballroom doors. "Honestly?" I said quietly. "You just told a room full of people that I don't do anything important. You said I can't stick to anything. You called my service pretend." "Well, it's not like you're in combat," he said. "You're not enlisted. You don't know what real work is." "I'm a lieutenant commander," I said, my voice steady. "I've flown missions you'll never hear about. I've led sailors through deployments you can't imagine. And I've done it while sending you money, fixing your problems, and trying to keep you from falling apart." His face went red. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I'm your father." "Then act like it," I said. He stared at me, breathing hard, and for a second I thought he might actually hear me. But then he shook his head and said, "You've embarrassed this family by playing dress-up in a uniform. You're not a real officer. You're just a quota hire who got lucky." Something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not violently. Just cleanly. I looked at him and realized I didn't recognize the man in front of me. Or maybe I finally did. "I'm done," I said. "Done with what?" "With this," I said. "With trying. With hoping. With pretending this is something it's not." I walked past him, back into the ballroom, and didn't look back. The next morning, I flew back to base. I didn't say goodbye. For weeks after the gala, I replayed the confrontation in my head. Not obsessively, just persistently. The way you replay a near miss on the highway or a hard conversation that didn't go the way you'd hoped. I kept thinking about the look on his face when I said I was done. He'd seemed genuinely surprised, like he couldn't believe I'd finally said it out loud. I talked to Captain Mercer again. She was patient with me, the way good mentors are when you need to process something slowly. "You know what the problem is?" she said during one of our calls. "You keep thinking this is about you. It's not. It's about him." "I know that intellectually," I said. "But it doesn't make it easier." "It's not supposed to be easy," she said. "You're grieving. You're grieving the father you deserved and didn't get." That landed hard. I hadn't thought of it as grief, but she was right. I was mourning something that had never existed, a version of my father who saw me clearly and loved me anyway. I started pulling back in concrete ways. I stopped answering his calls immediately. I stopped sending money without asking questions first. I stopped volunteering to help with things he should have been handling himself. It felt selfish at first, like I was abandoning him. But slowly, I realized I wasn't abandoning him. I was just stopping the pattern of me doing everything while he did nothing. My sailors noticed the shift. Not in my performance, I kept that locked down, but in my demeanor. I was quieter, more internal. One of my junior officers, Lieutenant Priya Rao, asked if I was okay during a flight debrief. "I'm fine," I said. "Just dealing with some family stuff." She nodded, didn't push. But later, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, ma'am, you're always telling us to set boundaries with people who don't respect the chain of command. Maybe that applies to family too." She was right. I'd spent years teaching young officers how to stand up for themselves, how to recognize toxic leadership, how to protect their own well-being. But I'd never applied those lessons to my own life. I started doing that now. When Dad called asking for money to fix his truck, I asked him why he needed it. He got defensive, said I was interrogating him. I told him I wasn't giving him money without knowing what it was for. He hung up on me. When he called back a week later, angrier this time, I didn't answer. He left a voicemail calling me selfish, ungrateful, and arrogant. He said I'd gotten full of myself because of some pins on a uniform. I saved the voicemail. Not to use against him, but to remind myself of what I was dealing with. Mom called after that. She was gentle, worried. "He's upset, Stella. He feels like you're shutting him out." "I'm not shutting him out," I said. "I'm just not doing everything for him anymore. He's your father." "I know. But that doesn't mean I owe him unconditional support when he gives me nothing but criticism." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I just don't want you to regret this later." "I won't," I said. And I meant it. The consequences for Dad were immediate and uncomfortable. Without me smoothing things over, fixing problems, and providing financial backup, his life started showing cracks. He fought with people at the lodge. He lost a part-time gig he'd been doing under the table because he couldn't keep his temper in check. He stopped being invited to certain family gatherings because people were tired of his complaints. I heard about it all secondhand through Mom, through relatives, through the small-town grapevine. Part of me felt guilty. Part of me felt vindicated. Mostly, I felt sad. But I didn't step in. I didn't fix it. I let him sit with the consequences of his own behavior. For me, the consequence was guilt. Deep, persistent, irrational guilt. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it still felt wrong. I kept thinking about the version of him I'd known as a kid, the one who taught me how to change a tire, who took me fishing once or twice, who wasn't always this bitter. I mourned that version of him, even though I wasn't sure he'd ever really existed. But I didn't go back. I stayed firm. One night, about 3 months after the gala, he called me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Stella," he said. His voice sounded different. Smaller. "What do you need, Dad?" "I don't need anything," he said. "I just wanted to talk." I waited. "I heard you got promoted," he said. I had. I'd made commander a few weeks earlier. I hadn't told him. "Yeah," I said. "That's good," he said. Then, after a pause, "That's really good." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close. But it was the first time he'd acknowledged my career without undermining it. "Thanks," I said. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully, like two people walking on ice. When we hung up, I didn't feel relief. I felt exhausted. But I also felt something else. A small, fragile sense that maybe the boundary I'd set was finally being respected. The years that followed were strange. Dad and I maintained a kind of careful distance, enough contact to stay connected, but not enough for him to hurt me the way he used to. I advanced to commander at 40, a rank that required serious command experience and strong evaluations. It was a milestone I was genuinely proud of, but I didn't expect much from him. I was right not to. When I called to tell him, he said, "That's good, Stella." Then, after a pause, though I heard they're promoting people faster now. Rank inflation or something. I didn't argue. I just said, "Okay, Dad," and changed the subject. Mom was more enthusiastic. She asked about the ceremony, about what it meant, about my responsibilities. I appreciated that, even though I knew she was trying to compensate for him. Professionally, things were going well. I took command of a squadron, oversaw complex operations, and built a reputation as someone who got results without burning people out. My sailors respected me. My peers trusted me. My superiors gave me challenging assignments because they knew I'd handle them. I was good at my job. I knew that. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. But Dad's life was unraveling. He'd had a falling out with the Veterans Lodge over something petty, an argument about dues or event planning. I never got the full story. He stopped going, which meant he lost his main social outlet. He picked up work here and there, but nothing steady. He started getting into arguments with neighbors, with store clerks, with anyone who didn't agree with him. Mom told me he was lonely. I told her he'd made his own choices. "He's struggling, Stella," she said. "I know," I said. "But I can't fix that for him." "I'm not asking you to fix it," she said. "I'm just asking you to be patient." "I have been patient," I said. "For 40 years. She didn't argue with that. Then, something shifted. I was deployed overseas, running a complex operation that involved coordinating multiple units across a contested region. The details are still classified, but it was the kind of mission that tests everything: leadership, decision-making, technical skill, and the ability to stay calm when everything is going wrong. We pulled it off. Not perfectly, but well enough that people noticed. When I got back stateside, I found out I'd been recommended for a commendation. Not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but the kind of thing that moves careers forward. Senior leadership had taken notice. My name was being mentioned in rooms I'd never been in. Dad heard about it through a relative who'd seen something online. He called me, and for once, he sounded genuinely interested. "I saw they wrote about you," he said. "Something about a rescue operation?" "It wasn't a rescue," I said. It was more complicated than that. But people are saying you did something impressive. We did something impressive, I said. It was a team effort. Still, he said. That's something. It was the closest he'd come to real pride, and I hated that it mattered to me. But it did. We talked for a few more minutes, and then he said something that caught me off guard. I told the guys at the diner about it, he said. About what you did. You did? Yeah, he said. They were impressed. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to ask why he'd never been impressed before. Part of me wanted to just let it go. I chose the latter. Thanks, Dad, I said. When we hung up, I sat with a feeling for a while. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more like sadness mixed with relief. Maybe he was changing. Maybe he wasn't. Either way, I wasn't going to build my life around waiting for him to figure it out. A few months later, he called again. His voice sounded strained. I need to talk to you about something, he said. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, he said, too quickly. I've been thinking. About how I've acted. About how I've treated you. I waited, my heart beating faster than I wanted it to. I know I haven't been great, he said. I know I've said things I shouldn't have. Okay, I said carefully. I just want you to know that I see what you've done, he said. I see how hard you've worked. And I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes. I'd waited my whole life to hear those words. And now that I didn't know what to do with them. Thank you, I said quietly. I mean it, he said. I really do. We talked a little longer, and when we hung up, I cried. Not because I was happy exactly, but because something I'd been carrying for 40 years finally felt a little lighter. I didn't know if it would last. I didn't know if he'd relapse into old patterns. But for that moment, it was enough. At 41, I was still a commander, which was fine by me. I wasn't chasing stars. I was focused on doing the work, taking care of my people, and building a life that felt meaningful. I'd stopped measuring my worth by my father's standards, and that shift had changed everything. Then I got invited to a Joint Forces ceremony recognizing aviation units for distinguished actions. It was a big event, formal, high-profile, with senior leadership from multiple branches. I wasn't expecting much beyond shaking a few hands and representing my squadron, but it felt like an honor to be included. I mentioned it to Dad during one of our now semi-regular phone calls. To my surprise, he asked if he could come. You want to attend? I said, caught off guard. Yeah, he said. I'd like to see what you do. For real this time. I hesitated. Part of me didn't trust it. But part of me wanted to give him the chance. Okay, I said. I'll get you a visitor pass. The ceremony was held at a joint base about 2 hours from where I was stationed. The flight line was pristine, the weather was clear, and the whole setup had that polished, official feel that the military does well when it wants to impress people. Dad arrived early, looking uncomfortable in a sports jacket that didn't quite fit. I met him near the gate and walked him through security. He was quiet, taking everything in, the aircraft, the personnel, the sense of coordinated purpose. This is bigger than I thought, he said. It's a major event, I said. Lots of units being recognized. We found seats near the front. I introduced him to a few of my colleagues, and he shook hands politely, but I could tell he was out of his element. He kept glancing around like he was trying to find his place in all of it. The ceremony started with the usual formalities, national anthem, opening remarks, a speech from a 2-star general. Then they began recognizing individual units. When my squadron was called, I stood and walked to the front with my team. We received a commendation for operational excellence, and I shook hands with the presenting officer, a calm, focused man I'd met briefly during the mission debrief. When I returned to my seat, Dad leaned over and said, "That was good. Really good." I nodded, trying not to read too much into it. After the ceremony, there was a reception on the flight line. Senior officers mingled with unit commanders, and the whole thing had a relaxed, celebratory feel. I was talking to Lieutenant Commander Rao when I saw Dad wander off toward a group of officers near one of the aircraft. I didn't think much of it. He was an adult. He could handle himself. Then I heard his voice, louder than it should have been. I turned and saw him talking to a tall man in an Air Force uniform. The man had 4 stars on his shoulders. General Marcus Alden. I recognized him from the program. He was the senior officer overseeing the ceremony. And my father was talking to him. I started walking over, my stomach sinking. As I got closer, I heard Dad say, This is my failed child. She never did anything with her life. The general turned, looked at me, and his expression shifted. He glanced down at my name tag, then back at my face. His cigar hung loose in his hand. He stepped forward, gently but firmly pushing my father aside, and locked eyes with me. Then he snapped to attention and saluted. "Commander Dalton," he said. "Nighthawk." I returned the salute, my mind racing. "Yes, sir," I said. "Ma'am, it's an honor," he said. "You saved lives out there. What you did in that operation," he shook his head. "That was extraordinary leadership under pressure. Your decisions made the difference." I felt the blood rush to my face. "Thank you, sir. It was a team effort." "It always is," he said. "But you were the one holding it together." I read the reports. "I know what you did." Behind him, my father stood frozen, his face pale. The general continued, asking me about specific tactical decisions, about how we'd coordinated with ground units, about the challenges we'd faced. He spoke to me like a peer, with respect and genuine curiosity. I answered his questions, keeping my responses professional, but I was intensely aware of my father standing just a few feet away, silent and still. When the conversation wrapped up, the general shook my hand again. "Seriously, Commander," he said. "You're exactly the kind of officer we need leading our people. Don't ever doubt that." "Thank you, sir," I said. He nodded and walked off, leaving me standing there with my father. I turned to face him. His mouth was open slightly, like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. His hands were shaking. "Dad," I said quietly. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know." "You never asked," I said. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not pride. Not admiration. Just raw, undeniable recognition. He saw me. Really saw me. "Stella," he said. It didn't have to be like this," I said. "It never had to be like this." He nodded slowly, still trembling. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, letting him sit with the weight of 40 years of dismissiveness collapsing in a single moment. "I need to get back to my team," I said. "We can talk later." I walked away, back toward my squadron, and didn't look back. That night, I sat alone in my quarters and let the day settle over me. I kept replaying the look on my father's face when the general saluted me. The disbelief. The shock. The sudden, unavoidable realization that everything he'd told himself about me was wrong. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Captain Mercer called to congratulate me on the commendation. I told her what had happened with my father. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Honestly?" I said. "I don't know." "That's fair," she said. "Give yourself time." I did. Over the next few weeks, Dad tried to reach out several times. Calls, texts, even a handwritten letter that arrived at my base address. I didn't ignore him, but I didn't rush to respond either. When I finally called him back, he sounded different. Quieter. Humbler. "I'm sorry," he said. "For everything. For all of it." "Okay," I said. "I mean it, Stella. I was wrong. About everything." "I know you were," I said. "But that doesn't undo 40 years. "I know," he said. I want to try. I want to do better." "Then do better," I said. "Don't tell me. Show me." He agreed. And over the months that followed, he tried. Not perfectly, but genuinely. He asked about my work. He stopped undermining me. He started treating me like someone worth respecting. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. The damage was too deep for that. But it was something. A start. A shift. I moved forward with my career, my team, my life. I kept setting boundaries. I kept protecting my peace. And slowly, carefully, I let my father back in, but only as much as he earned. Because I'd learned the hardest lesson of all: respect isn't owed. It's earned. And someone else's failure to see your worth has never been your burden to carry. I didn't need a 4-star general to validate me. But I'm not going to lie, it felt good to watch my father finally understand what he'd been too blind to see. I was worth seeing all along. 20 years is a long time in the military. Long enough for entire careers to begin and end. Long enough for the geopolitical landscape to shift multiple times. Long enough for relationships to evolve or dissolve completely. Long enough for a commander to become something else entirely. I'm 61 now. Rear Admiral Stella Dalton, though most people on base still call me Nighthawk when they think I'm not listening. I've held this rank for 3 years, and if I'm being honest, I never thought I'd make it this far. Not because I doubted my abilities, but because the higher you climb, the more politics come into play, and I've never been particularly good at playing those games. I just kept doing the work, taking care of my people, and making decisions I could defend. Apparently, that was enough. My father is 88 now. He lives in an assisted living facility about 40 minutes from where I'm currently stationed, a coincidence of assignment timing that neither of us planned, but both of us have quietly appreciated. He's in relatively good health for his age, though he moves slower, his hearing is going, and his memory has soft edges now. He's not the man who humiliated me at that gala. He's not even the man who stood pale and trembling on the flight line 20 years ago. He's something softer. Something I'm still learning to understand. Mom passed away 6 years ago. Cardiac arrest, sudden and merciless. She was shopping for groceries 1 minute and gone the next. Dad called me from the hospital, his voice shattered in a way I'd never heard before. I took emergency leave and flew home within hours. We buried her on a Tuesday in the small cemetery where her parents were buried, and for 3 days, Dad and I existed in a strange bubble of shared grief that temporarily erased decades of conflict. After the funeral, when relatives had gone home and the casseroles had been distributed, Dad and I sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd once criticized everything I did, and he looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and said, "I don't know how to do this without her." "Neither do I said. That was the truth. Mom had been the buffer, the translator, the one who kept the peace and smoothed the rough edges. Without her, Dad and I had to figure out how to relate to each other directly, without her gentle interventions. It was harder than either of us expected. In the immediate aftermath of her death, Dad tried to lean on me the way he'd leaned on her. He called constantly, wanted me to handle everything, expected me to fill the void she'd left. I had to set boundaries again, firmly but not cruelly. I helped him find the assisted living facility. I set up his finances so his bills paid automatically. I visited when I could. But I didn't become his caretaker. I didn't sacrifice my career or my sanity to manage his grief. He resented that at first. I could hear it in his voice during our phone calls, that edge of disappointment, like I was failing him again. But over time, he adjusted. He made friends at the facility. He joined a woodworking group. He started attending the weekly Veterans Coffee Hour. He built a life that didn't require me to hold it together. And slowly, something unexpected happened. We started actually talking. Not the surface-level updates we'd exchanged for years, but real conversations. He asked about my work, and I told him, careful not to share classified information, but honest about the challenges of leadership at this level. He told me about his past, things he'd never mentioned before. His own father's criticism. His sense of failure when he left the army. The shame he'd carried for decades about not becoming an officer. "I took it out on you," he said during one visit. "Because you did what I couldn't. And I hated myself for that. So I made you feel small." "I know," I said. "Does it help?" he asked. "Knowing why?" "A little," I said. "But it doesn't undo it." "I know," he said quietly. These conversations happened in fragments over years. We didn't have one big healing moment. We had dozens of small ones, scattered between visits and phone calls and the ordinary rhythms of life. Trust rebuilt itself slowly, like bone healing after a fracture, painful, imperfect, but functional. Ryan and I grew closer during this period too. He'd always been caught in the middle of my relationship with Dad, and after Mom died, he finally felt free to acknowledge how messed up things had been. We started having honest conversations about our childhood, about the favoritism, about the damage it had caused. He apologized for not standing up for me more. I told him it wasn't his fault. We both cried during that conversation, sitting in his truck outside the assisted living facility after a visit with Dad. "He's different now," Ryan said. "But I remember how he was. I remember what he did to you." "I remember too," I said. "But I'm trying to let him be different." "Do you forgive him?" Ryan asked. I thought about that for a long time. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I've accepted what happened. I've moved past it. But I haven't forgotten it either. Ryan nodded. That seems fair. My career continued to evolve. As a rear admiral, I oversaw multiple commands, shaped policy, mentored the next generation of officers, and dealt with challenges that would have seemed impossible when I was a young ensign. I worked on integrating new technologies into naval aviation. I testified before Congress twice. I managed a crisis in the Pacific that could have escalated into something much worse if we'd handled it poorly. I attended funerals for sailors who died under my watch and wrote letters to their families that I still think about late at night. The weight of the stars on my shoulders is different from anything I'd carried before. It's not just responsibility, it's legacy. Every decision I make affects hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Every policy I shape will outlast my time in the Navy. Every officer I mentor will carry forward something I taught them, for better or worse. I take that seriously. Dad started asking better questions about my work. Instead of dismissing it or minimizing it, he'd ask things like, how do you make a decision when there's no good option? Or what do you do when someone you trust lets you down? These weren't casual questions. He was genuinely trying to understand the nature of leadership at this level. I answered honestly. I told him about the loneliness of command, about the impossibility of pleasing everyone, about the weight of knowing that your decisions could get people killed. He listened in a way he'd never listened before. One day, about a year ago, I was visiting him at the facility. We were sitting in the common room, watching other residents play cards, when he said, I understand now why you couldn't just come home and fix everything for me. What do you mean? I said, when your mom died, he said, I wanted you to drop everything and take care of me. But you had responsibilities. People depending on you. You couldn't just abandon that. No, I said. I couldn't. I was angry about it, he said. But I get it now. You weren't being selfish. You were being responsible. Thank you for understanding that, I said. He nodded slowly. I spent a lot of years not understanding you. I'm trying to do better. I know you are, I said. The conversation drifted to other things, but that moment stayed with me. It was the kind of acknowledgement I'd needed 20 years ago, or 30, or 40. It didn't erase the past, but it honored the present. I thought about Captain Mercer often during this period. She'd retired 5 years ago and moved to Oregon with her wife. We still talked occasionally, long phone calls where we discussed leadership, aging, legacy, and the strange shape of military careers. She'd been right about so much when I was younger, about my father's resentment, about the importance of boundaries, about protecting my own worth. How's your dad? She asked during our most recent call. Better, I said. Different. Do you believe the change is real? She asked. I think it's as real as it can be, I said. He's not the same person he was. But he's also 88. I don't know how much of the change is growth and how much is just age softening him. Does it matter? She asked. I thought about that. Maybe not. Maybe I just need to accept what is instead of analyzing why. That sounds like wisdom, she said. Or exhaustion, I said, and we both laughed. My social life had evolved too. I dated on and off over the years, nothing serious until my late 40s when I met Dr. Sarachin, a civilian trauma surgeon who worked at a naval hospital. We'd been together for 12 years now, married for 8. She understood the demands of my career because her own career made similar demands. We'd built a life that worked around deployments, long hours, and the reality that we were both driven people who'd chosen professions over conventional domesticity. Dad liked Sarah. He'd been awkward around her at first, clearly unsure how to interact with my spouse, but Sarah had a gift for putting people at ease. She asked him about woodworking, listened to his stories, and treated him with kindness without letting him dominate the conversation. After a few visits, he relaxed around her. She's good for you, he told me once. She keeps you grounded. She does, I said. I'm glad you have her, he said. I worried for a long time that you were alone. I was alone for a long time, I said. But I was never lonely. There's a difference. He looked at me thoughtfully. I think I'm starting to understand that. One of the unexpected gifts of the past 20 years has been watching Dad develop real respect for what I do. It started after the incident with General Alden, but it deepened over time as he began to truly comprehend the scope of naval operations, the complexity of modern military leadership, and the significance of the rank I held. He started reading about naval history. He watched documentaries about carrier operations. He asked me to explain things, how command structures worked, what different warfare communities did, why certain decisions got made at the strategic level. He approached it like a student, genuinely trying to understand a world he dismissed for decades. When I made Rear Admiral, he was in the audience at my promotion ceremony. Sarah sat beside him, and I could see them talking quietly during the speeches. Afterward, when I walked over in my new uniform with the stars freshly pinned, Dad stood up carefully, his knees aren't what they used to be, and saluted me. It was clumsy, his form wasn't perfect, but the gesture was sincere. I returned the salute, and then he pulled me into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to say it." "I know, Dad," I said. "I know." That moment was witnessed by dozens of people, fellow officers, sailors, family, friends, but it felt intensely private. It was the culmination of decades of struggle, pain, distance, and slow, painful reconciliation. Sarah told me later that Dad had cried during the ceremony. Not openly, just quiet tears he kept wiping away when he thought no one was looking. "He knows what he missed," Sarah said. "He knows what he almost lost." "Yeah," I said. "He does." The military throws retirement ceremonies for senior officers, formal events where your career gets summarized, your achievements get recognized, and you officially transition from active duty to veteran status. Mine is scheduled for 6 months from now. I'll be 62, having served for 40 years. The Navy will continue without me, which is exactly how it should be. I've trained my replacement, mentored the officers coming up behind me, and built systems that will outlast my tenure. Dad asks about retirement constantly now. He wants to know what I'm going to do, where Sarah and I are going to live, whether I'll finally have time to relax. I tell him we're planning to move to the coast, somewhere quieter, where I can decompress and figure out who I am without the uniform. "Will you miss it?" he asks. "Every day," I say. "But it's time." "You gave them 40 years, he says. "That's more than most people give anything." "It didn't feel like giving," I say. "It felt like being exactly who I was supposed to be." He nods, understanding in a way he couldn't have 20 years ago. Last month, I took Dad to a naval museum about an hour from the facility. They had an exhibit on naval aviation, and I thought he might enjoy it. We walked slowly through the displays, him with his cane, me adjusting my pace to match his. He stopped at a display about Vietnam-era pilots, reading the descriptions carefully. "I was jealous of these guys," he said suddenly. "The pilots. The officers. Everyone who did more than I did." "You did enough," I said. "You served honorably." "But I wanted more," he said. "And when I couldn't have it, I resented everyone who did. Including you. Especially you." "I know," I said. "It was never about you," he said, turning to look at me. "It was always about me. About my failure. About my limitations. You just happened to be the mirror that showed me everything I wasn't." "That's a heavy thing to put on a kid," I said gently. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry. I've said it before, but I'll keep saying it. I'm sorry." We stood there for a moment, two people separated by 3 decades in age, but connected by blood, history, and the complicated shape of forgiveness. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "I really do." We continued through the museum, and he asked me questions about the aircraft, about the missions, about the technical aspects of naval aviation. I answered patiently, enjoying his curiosity, grateful for the shift in our dynamic. Near the end of the visit, we stopped in front of a display honoring contemporary naval aviators. My name was there, listed among others who'd received significant commendations. Dad stared at it for a long time. "There you are," he said quietly. "Nighthawk." "Yeah," I said. "There I am." "They should make the letters bigger," he said, a hint of his old stubbornness showing through. "You deserve bigger letters." I laughed, genuinely surprised. "It's fine, Dad. I don't need bigger letters." "Well, I think you do," he said firmly. That night, Sarah asked me how the visit went. "Good," I said. "Really good, actually." "He's changed a lot," she observed. "He has," I said. "Or maybe I've changed enough that I can see him differently now." "Maybe it's both," she said. "Maybe," I agreed. I've spent a lot of time over the past 20 years thinking about legacy, not just my professional legacy, but my personal one. What story will people tell about me when I'm gone? What will my sailors remember? What will my family say? And more specifically, what will my father remember? I think he'll remember that I was patient with him, even when he didn't deserve it. That I held him accountable without destroying him. That I gave him space to grow, even in his 80s. that I didn't let his failures define me. I hope he'll remember that I was kind. The relationship we have now isn't perfect. We still have difficult moments. He still says things that sting occasionally, though now he catches himself and apologizes. I still have to set boundaries, though they're different boundaries than before. We still carry the weight of our history, but we've learned to carry it together instead of letting it crush us separately. Ryan told me recently that Dad talks about me constantly at the facility. He shows people my picture, tells them stories about my career, brags about my rank. It's almost comical, given how much he downplayed everything for so many years. He's making up for lost time, Ryan said. I guess so, I said. Does it bother you? Ryan asked. That he's proud now after everything? No, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. It doesn't bother me. It just is. That's the truth I've arrived at after 61 years, 40 years of service, and decades of complicated family dynamics. Some things just are. They don't need to be fixed or explained or justified. They just exist, imperfect and human and real. My father was a deeply flawed man who hurt me in ways that shaped my entire life. He was also a man who struggled with his own demons, his own limitations, his own failures. He did terrible damage, and he also did his best with the tools he had. Both things are true. I became who I am partly because of him and partly in spite of him. I learned discipline from his criticism. I learned resilience from his dismissiveness. I learned the importance of recognition because I spent so long without it. His failures taught me how to be a better leader, a better mentor, a better human. I don't thank him for that. I don't frame my trauma as a gift. But I acknowledge the complexity of it, the way pain and growth can exist in the same space. 3 weeks ago, I was visiting Dad when he asked me something unexpected. Do you think you'll forgive me? He said. Really forgive me, I mean. Not just say it, but mean it. I thought carefully before answering. I think I already have, Dad. Just not in the way you might imagine. What do you mean? He asked. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, I said. It doesn't mean pretending things didn't happen or that they didn't hurt. It means I've stopped letting what happened control my life. It means I see you as you are now, not just as you were then. And how am I now? He asked quietly. You're an 88-year-old man who's trying to make peace with his past, I said. You're someone who made mistakes and owned them. You're my father, and I love you, even though loving you has been complicated. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. That's fair, he said. That's more than fair. We sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the afternoon light filter through the windows of the common room. Two people who'd spent decades fighting to understand each other, finally arriving at something like peace. I leave his facility that day thinking about the strange mathematics of family, how the people who hurt us most deeply are often the people we keep trying to save. How forgiveness isn't a single act, but a series of choices made over years. How love can exist alongside anger, disappointment alongside hope. I think about the young ensign I was 40 years ago, desperate for her father's approval, willing to bend herself into impossible shapes to earn it. I think about the lieutenant commander who finally drew a boundary, who walked away from a gala with her head high. I think about the commander who stood on a flight line and watched her father's illusions shatter. And I think about the rear admiral I am now, 6 months from retirement, looking back on a career that exceeded every dream I had as a young woman in ROTC. My father didn't make me who I am, but he was part of the story. And I've made peace with that. The stars on my shoulders aren't for him. They never were. They're for the sailors I've led, the missions I've flown, the decisions I've made, and the person I've become despite and because of everything I've experienced. But when I visit him next week and he asks to see my uniform one more time, I'll show him. When he traces the stars with his weathered fingers and says, I can't believe my daughter is an admiral, I'll let him have that moment. Not because I need his validation anymore, but because after 40 years of serving my country and 61 years of being his daughter, I've learned that grace is stronger than resentment. And some battles are worth winning slowly. So that's how it ended, not with revenge, but with truth finally catching up to someone who spent years tearing me down. I didn't win because a general recognized me. I won because I stopped letting someone define my worth. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where someone who underestimated you finally saw the real you? Did you stand up for yourself, or are you still carrying that weight? Drop your story in the comments. You never know who you might help. If this hit home, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect isn't optional. Thanks for being here. We'll talk soon.